Welcome to the Rock Newman Show.
It's the Rock Newman Show.
Do we know who, like, the first formally trained doctor was? I'm sure there were midwives and babies being born, so babies were being born, and somebody was there while they were being born.
Yes.
Now, do we have any information on that?
What an excellent question. I'm always honored to talk about, we call her Amazing Grace. Her name was Grace Brooks, and she was this individual that you're talking about. She was born in 1740, and in 1788, she does something very, very extraordinary, and in fact is one of the first in the country to do this. She emancipates herself, her children, and her grandchildren in one transaction for 70 pounds in 1788, 70 years prior to the Emancipation Proclamation.
Okay, let me ask you. So it makes me think right away. Grace Brooks.
Yes.
Emancipated herself.
And her children. And her grandchildren.
Now, do you know if she was an offspring of a slave master, or do you have any idea of her parentage?
We do not, although it is very likely, based on how she's described and based on how she was perhaps brought up on the plantation in which she was enslaved.
Right.
It is very likely that she is a product of the slave master.
Because, I mean, I know there are a lot of Brookses out there.
Oh, absolutely.
And I asked that question because if you had told me she was like a very dark-skinned Brooks, my first girlfriend was a very dark-skinned Brooks. Her name was Ivia Brooks. And so probably not necessarily have that lineage there. Not necessarily.
You never know.
We don't. And I'm telling you, what you're sharing with us today sort of... It certainly opens my eyes up, and I'm hoping that it opens up the eyes of others. So please go on and tell me. She liberated herself and her children.
And her children and her grandchildren.
And her grandchildren.
And she did this for 70 pounds. So one question is, where does a African-American female who was a slave in 1788 and prior get 70 pounds, which is a substantial amount of money in 1788? And doing this 70 years prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. And doing that 3 transactions in one. It was a big deal to emancipate yourself.
Right.
But to get your children and also to get your grandchildren is quite extraordinary. And not one record has surfaced for that ever happening in America. So she is probably the first person, regardless of color, who had ever done so. And she does that and moves into this community after she leaves the plantation. And by 1792...
moves into the community, The Hill.
The Hill. She purchases her own home as single head of her household. And that house is a house that still stands, for which persons can come and see. Wow. And it is fully documented. However, it had never had any attachments to her. So the history of that house has always been praised for its European architecture, if you will, and for being one of the oldest structures in the town of Easton, but never affiliated with this rich woman named Grace Brooks, who was a free African-American, who purchased her freedom, for which her records had always existed. No one knew about her. Her own descendants had no idea who she was.
Okay, so just, keeping it basic and going back, where did she get the 70 pounds? Is there a determination of that?
We have no records to support where she received the 70 pounds.
Okay.
Obviously, the records indicate and verify, in fact, that she paid the 70 pounds, so she certainly had it. But how she earned that mony is unknown.
Okay, so then not so many years later, she moves into this...
She moves to the Hill.
To this grand home.
Precisely. And she's a midwife in the community.
I mean, because that's how we started. I was saying about the doctor.
Absolutely, absolutely. And she's serving the white and the black community. And she is very liked in the community. She, at her death in 1810, she is one of the first, again, women, not just black or white, but women to have an obituary. Women wouldn't have had an obituary, so to speak, in 1810. And she has a full-page obituary, which really helps us to understand who she was in the community and exactly what she did. She's likened in that obituary to Benjamin Banneker, who works with LaFont to lay out the plan of Washington, D.C., which didn't exist during the era that we're talking about all of this history.
Sure.
And she's likened to Phyllis Wheatley, who is one of the first African-American poets. And we're sitting down in the space of Langston Hughes.
Hello.
A later period. But she's also talked about as being of sable hue and not being black and not being dark and not being a Negro and what have you. So they talk about her in ways that are so eloquent and in ways that make her a human being for which other African Americans would not have been spoken of as such. And so she was quite a remarkable, and as I said, as she's often being referred to, a amazing grace. And so we are so privileged to have uncovered her legacy and to be able to share now with the world as we remember this place as the Hill.
As the Hill. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound.
Absolutely.
You're going to hear us when we come. We're going to hear our sound when we come back after these messages on the Rock Newman Show. We're with Professor Dale Green from the Architecture and Historic Preservation Department at Morgan State University. We'll be back in a moment.
Rock Newman Show. It's the Rock Newman Show. Rock Newman Show.